This is a formal welcome to everyone. I'm Carol Kelly from the Arupe Virtual Learning Institute, and it is our pleasure once again to partner with the Jesuit School Network and to bring you part of another section of their series, Ignatian Inquiry series. And today, of course, an exploration of the Marquette University College of Education Research Study, Coming of Age in the Age of COVID-19, featuring Dr. Gabriel Velez. And as always, when we host a webinar here at the Arupe Virtual Learning Institute, we want to start in the right frame of mind and start with a reflection prayer. So I would like to do that now, and I'm going to share my screen. I'll read, and you could read along if you would. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Father, we pray in particular for all those struggling with health, security, and inclusion during this pandemic. Often, we want to be able to see into the future. We say, how will next year be for me? Where will I be 5 or 10 years from now? There are no answers to these questions. Mostly, we have just enough light to see the next step, what we must do in the coming hour or the following day. The art of living is to enjoy what we can see and not complain about what remains in the dark. When we are able to take the next step with the trust that we will have enough light for the step that follows, we can walk through life with joy and be surprised at how far we go. Let's rejoice in the little light we carry and not ask for the great beam that would take all shadows away. And this reflection from Father Henri Nguyen. We pray for the grace of imagination, creativity, and patience. Amen. Well, it's my pleasure to welcome again my friend, I will say friend now, and colleague, Kristen Ross Culley. And for those of you who don't know her or her work, by way of just a quick introduction, Dr. Kristen, oops, I wanted to share this as well. I messed up my sharing screen. Hang on one second. So I think it's worth having it in print there for everyone to see her accomplishments. Dr. Kristen Ross Culley serves as the Director of Research, Development, and New Ventures with the Jesuit Schools Network Conference Office. She began her work in Jesuit education in 1999, and prior to her current role with the JSN, she was Assistant Principal of Regis High School and Principal of Loyola School, both in New York City. And I have visited both of those schools and was impressed by how they work. And I know that Kristen's hand is on that still with her colleagues there. So I'm going to turn things over now to Kristen, and she will introduce Dr. Gabriel Velez. And you'll see me in the background managing the chat screen if you want to ask a question. Feel free to type it into the question area or the chat box, and we'll arrange for Dr. Velez to answer your questions as they come up. And at the end as well, we'll save about 15 minutes at the end for a question and answer period. So take it away, Kristen, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Carol. And thank you to everyone for being here today, knowing well how busy your plates are across so many different schools. We're really grateful for your time here for the next hour. On behalf of the Jesuit Schools Network Conference Office, welcome to our latest Ignatian Inquiry virtual session, a component of our research development platform. As you know, the JSN is eager to encourage a spirit of inquiry across the many layers of our work in Jesuit education. We envision our particular brand of Ignatian Inquiry to be defined as the art of inquiry as seen through our Ignatian lens, asking questions and exploring issues that matter in our schools through the frame of our shared Jesuit mission. Many of you are familiar with the various events and programs by the JSN, where we have an opportunity to connect across schools with our fellow educators. Programs like our seminars in Ignatian leadership, our many colleague gatherings, and the colloquium that is held every 3 years. Those opportunities to connect in person provide exceptional means to branch out of our own worlds, our own offices, classrooms, hallways, to learn about the work in other schools that are going on across the network. The idea of these Ignatian Inquiry virtual sessions is that we will carve out space to connect virtually in the time in between our many in-person gatherings. And of course, in this unusual year, without those in-person gatherings, this is more important than ever. And with the support of AVLI, we are able to meet virtually in this space to share and to talk and to learn about the good work that is going on across our schools in North America. Of course, in the years since we developed these inquiry sessions, all of our schools have gone virtual in one way or another. So this is in an even more timely format than we could have anticipated when the idea bloomed. In this webinar, we will learn from Dr. Gabriel Velez, an assistant professor and developmental psychologist in the Department of Education, Educational Policy and Leadership in the College of Education at Marquette University. Dr. Velez studies identity development in adolescents, particularly in relation to citizenship, human rights, and peace, including young people's understanding and responses to peace education and restorative practices in their schools. He has collaborated extensively with schools and nonprofit educational organizations in Milwaukee and Columbia. He graduated from our own Regis High School in 2003 and then earned a BA in History and Literature from Harvard University and an MA and PhD in Comparative Human Development from the University of Chicago. Between time as an undergraduate and his doctoral studies, he taught in a Nativity Network school in Harlem and spent 2 years in Peru serving as a Jesuit volunteer. Last spring, Gabriel contacted us at the JSN to inquire if we would be interested in being a part of his research study exploring the effects of COVID-19 on adolescent perspectives of their world. Considering the timeliness of his work and the fact that at that point in the quarantine, all of our schools had moved to online learning, we jumped at the opportunity to support Jesuit schools and students in this way. This study aimed to provide an understanding of what some young people are going through and to help schools and others support them. Working through schools, he collected and analyzed over 1,000 young people's experiences of change and challenge related to the pandemic. We were so pleased that Creighton Prep, Rebuff, Regis High School, St. Ignatius Chicago, Cristo Rey Chicago, DeSmet, Loyola Montreal, St. Ignatius San Francisco, and Marquette High School were participants. His presentation today will be on the outcomes of this study, and I'll turn it over now to Dr. Velez to further introduce himself and to share his work. Gabriel?
Thank you, Kristen. I really appreciate that. Thank you for the introduction, and Carol as well. I'd like to thank the Jesuit Schools Network and Arupe Virtual Learning Institute as well, and all of you who are here. For those of you who engage in these kind of activities often, you know, it can be a little bit strange to be doing this in this kind of virtual space where it feels like you're almost talking to yourself. A lot of my college classes are constantly a struggle to get people to have their video on. But I do want to say that I am thinking about all of you who are out there, and I would sort of encourage you afterwards to reach out and be in contact with me about any follow-up or questions you might have about anything that I'm talking about. An hour is a very short time, but I'm really privileged and honored to be here and willing to share and have more thoughts and hopefully can support a little bit the work that all of you are doing. So I'm going to share my screen and then walk through a presentation talking a little bit about the study that Kristen mentioned, and then also speak a little bit more generally about some takeaways from some of the research that I've been doing and some of what I've been reading about how we can support young people during this time. So my presentation today is meant to this coming of age in the age of COVID. And I was thinking about this because my background in work is really about adolescents and how they come to understand who they are and the influences going into that. And so, you know, partly what was going on for me in the spring was, you know, what I was trying to process as an adult and what all that was going on meant for me. But I was also seeing in the media a lot about young people, right? And so there was a lot going on in the spring that was saying, young people may never be the same, these challenges that they're having, the impact on them. And then as the pandemic progressed to that language progressed to, oh, they're not taking it seriously, or, oh, they're, you know, not as deeply impacted by the physical aspect of the pandemic if they catch it. And so, you know, they're not as likely to sort of be concerned about it. But there's all this sort of discourse about young people. And at times, some of the things in the media, you know, would have one interview here, a couple interviews there. But there wasn't really much that I was seeing that was trying to gather in some broader and a little bit systematic way what young people were experiencing and what they were going through. And so that was sort of part of the work and what I was trying to get at in this research I'll present today. Now, very quickly up front, I just want to give you these two examples of two things that young people told me in this survey. because I think it really speaks to the wide diversity of what they're going through. So one young person, when I was asking about the impacts and challenges that they were facing, said, well, of course, and this is in a survey, so they wrote this, but of course, it's affecting my life all the time. I miss my friends, I miss school, I miss the gym, I just want to go out, and I absolutely hate losing touch with all of that. I was on a good path right before we all had to go into quarantine. I was socializing well, I was living life, I was happy, and I was becoming more confident as I continued working out at the gym. Coronavirus took all of that from me and so many other kids like me. And so you can see this one participant, right, was really deeply impacted in a way that affected many areas of their life and that they felt was something they were really struggling with. Another student in this survey responded to the same question by saying, keeping myself entertained, right? And so just a basic sense of kind of boredom of being quarantined and at home. So I sort of presented it up front because I do want to offer these kind of upfront takeaways. So things that I think if you're going to walk away from this, I want you to kind of have in mind from what I'm trying to sort of get across from what I was hearing from these young people and then in other work that I've read about and seen. And so the first one is that their lives are being disrupted. All of our lives to some degree are being disrupted, but they are very much in varied ways. And so it's really hard to, I think, talk about narratives of this is the way that all young people are. Right. And so sometimes we see that, and I think in the discourses about young people and assumptions are being made, but there is really a broad disruption in how they're experiencing, or sort of broad variance, I should say, in how they're experiencing that. A second is that the participants in my study had really still expressed high hopes for the future. So their sort of sense of optimism and hope in what is to come was not very sort of deeply undermined. And I'll talk a little bit about the timing of this because that's part of it, that it came in the spring. But also that they had strong feelings of social responsibility, that they still felt some sense of their identity is based in a connectedness to their community. And I think that's particularly noteworthy considering that the sample that I'm focusing on for this is those from Jesuit schools. Next, that virtual connection and schooling is a struggle. And for you, all of you who are educators, this is probably at its face value, I think something that, is very obvious, but I want to sort of think of this not just as schooling in the sense of content or a sense of logistics, but really as in a sense of sort of affecting the entire life. And so the struggle becomes more than just my grades or more than just my learning, but it becomes everything about me. And I'll speak to that in a little bit and what I mean. And then the last part is that they really need support, the young people, and what I was hearing in this study, in terms of coping and thinking through the changes in their learning and their futures, right? To some degree, their rug that some of them had has been pulled out from under them. The idea of this is what it was going to look like in my junior and senior year in high school. This is what the college going experience was going to look like. This is what I was imagining. And all of that was sort of upended. And so they need some support in how to rethink some of that. So in today's talk, I'm going to basically touch on first, what do I know about adolescents during COVID-19? So in this sense, give you some details and some of the findings from the study. Then what insights can I offer? So some sort of broader takeaways and some thoughts. Keeping in mind too that, all of you, I know your sort of particular context so much better. And so they're going to be sort of these broad ideas and buckets of things that I think are worth considering and thinking about. But as I mentioned, I'm very open to follow up where I would be happy to engage more and think through particular contexts or provide any insights I can. And then the last, where is this all going? And then finally ending with an opportunity to address questions and to sort of engage with all of you in the audience out there. So first to start, what do I know about adolescents during COVID-19? So one of the things that I mentioned was I was talking about in the spring, right, sitting there and thinking about how I was being affected. And so to start to kind of describe this was something that I saw at the time and I sort of followed. And this is coming out of the Census Bureau in the United States here, where they were doing a weekly study starting in April and then went through June about the ways that people felt that COVID-19 was impacting their life. And so this was a household study. And I don't think it was a nationally representative sample, but it was still pretty broadly across the US. And one of my takeaways here, and as I was seeing this develop week by week, was that, first of all, K through 12 educational changes are some of the biggest impacts that households and families are experiencing in general. Or I shouldn't say biggest, but maybe it's sort of the most broadly experienced. But then also when I looked at some of the other categories, and again, thinking about that this was adults in households and with families, all of these impact young people, right? They might be facing the loss of income from their parents and what stress is those tied to. They might be facing issues with medical care in their families. They might be facing issues with housing insecurity again. And so what I was thinking about is, how are young people processing this? How are they making sense of this? And how are they experiencing this? And so that's what sort of motivated the study. And with that, I went into kind of thinking through, like, what am I going to do? How am I going to collect these voices and perspectives? But also, I want to focus this around, what are they experiencing? But then also, how are they coping? What are the things that they're drawing on, either to try and make sense of it and to try and get through it, or that they're finding that they're really needing, that they're lacking and they're struggling with? And so with that sort of broader question in mind, the survey itself asked some closed-ended questions, so some questions where it asked them, please choose one of the following options, and then also some open-ended where I asked them to type in their responses. And some of the closed-ended questions includes ones on civic attitudes. So for an example, asking them to rate on a scale how much they agreed with, I can make a positive difference in my community. It also asked about levels of trust. And so here, sort of basically, how much do you trust the national government, political parties, schools, police as well? Some other of the closed-ended questions touched on social responsibility. So an example here was asking them how much they identify with, I often think about ways that I can make the world a better place. And then also what's kind of termed in the scale here, future mindedness, but kind of just a little bit of sense of like how they're thinking about the future. And so an example of this one was, I am hopeful about the future, and then asking them if that was something that they identified with. The open response questions, I was trying to get a little bit more of a sense of getting into their experience and letting them use their own words and letting them tell me what was going on. And so some examples of these questions included, what emotions are you feeling when you read or hear about COVID-19? How do you think that this is affecting your life at the present or not? In what ways might this epidemic change your community? So some of it was touching on them specifically, sort of how's it affecting you, how might it change your life? And some of it was a little broader, asking them to talk and think about their community. In the end, and so I sort of approached this by trying to reach out to as many schools as I could and connecting with folks like Kristen, who helped me get connected to a number of Jesuit schools. And so it was not a representative sample in the sense of it, you know, I can't say that these are young people everywhere, that these are young people from a particular group. But in the end, I was able to collect a pretty broad sample. And so there were over 900 participants. And they were grouped mostly in sort of a range of 10 to 15 schools. And these schools were in about 8 states. So it wasn't, again, you know, everywhere in the United States, but it wasn't just in one place either, and sort of very geographically centered. Of those 900 participants, 765 were from Jesuit high schools, and that's the sample that I'm going to focus on for the rest of today, that I'm going to sort of talk about. And those 765, their mean age was 15, a little over 15, closer to 16 years old. In terms of race, the sample was predominantly white, although there was a little bit of sort of representation from, or these young people who self-identified as belonging to other racial groups. And then 17% identified as Latino or Latina. Some of this too was dependent on, you know, which schools engaged and what their school populations tended to be like, because I was going through schools. And so one thing I do want to say up front here, and I'm going to come back to this later, is just that it was a little difficult to break down and look at things like race and ethnicity and how there might be differences in the sample from that. And I think that's particularly important to keep in mind because of the context, or because that there is so much out there about how COVID-19 and its impacts are disproportionate on Black and Brown communities, on communities with lower SES, sort of across them. And so that's something I want to recognize kind of upfront, but I'd also be happy to talk about in more detail. Going a little bit more into the sample, so you can see here that the majority were in 7th or 9th and 10th grade in terms of high school. There were a few that were in 12th grade, but not as much there. And that in terms of gender, it was heavily male. And again, this is particularly the sample that were in Jesuit high schools. And so I think some of that came from a high proportion of representation in all male high schools. So school like Regis High School, my own, that had a number of participants. So jumping into the findings now a little bit. So the first one is about trust. And the reason I share this is because I think it isn't necessarily shocking, but I think it's insightful and particularly about the time and the moment. And so I think before I jump into these, I should also note the timing again of these. And so I did this study, and these surveys went out between March and really end of May of this year. And so that comes right before the Black Lives protest really took off. And so some of the issues of race and ethnicity and injustice came to the forefront in the national consciousness. So this was during the time of quarantine, but sort of leading up to that second, what people have termed even like a pandemic around race and ethnicity and issues of injustice. And so in that, you can kind of see that this graph, what it shows is basically levels of trust that these participants expressed on average of these different institutions in society. And so what was kind of striking first to me is, and I'll highlight right there the bar in red from schools, because schools was the highest, sort of the students expressed the highest level of trust in schools. And I think that is both interesting and important, that they tended to trust their schools. And this also came in a moment when some of their connections to schools were being disrupted, when they were being heavily disrupted. And a lot of what was going on in their societies was being driven by political parties, by national government. And they were also getting their sources of information on this. They had to get them through the media and through social media, right? And as you can see, they had low levels of trust in some of those. A couple other things that I want to note here is if you actually looked at the number in schools, it was about 76%. So it was like 3/4 of the sample that said that they either completely or quite a lot trust their school. So there's a really high level of trust in those schools. I'll also note here that the level of trust in the police I think is high, and it's interesting because this becomes before some of the discussions of defunding the police and some of that movement. But I will note that that average I think is a little bit deceiving because it was very high and very low, so that there were a number of young people who expressed that they completely or quite a lot trusted the police, but then there was a large group too that was not at all. And so in the end, it was more weighted towards the higher side, but that was a very divided answer there. I think it's also particularly telling that the media and social media were pretty low, because I also asked them to talk a little bit about their sources of information, and media and social media were where they were getting their information, even though they're expressing these low levels of trust in them. So next, moving to social responsibility, I wanted to show sort of two responses to two questions to give you a sense of another kind of, I think, hopeful takeaway, which is that these young people still maintained a really high sense of feeling like they needed to contribute to their community, like that they were responsible for being active and participatory in their communities. And so here we have this graph showing that 82% said that they agree with the statement, I can make a positive difference in my community. So despite this being a time of quarantine, despite this being a time of being disconnected from their schools where maybe they're doing community service, they still expressed feeling this in large numbers, in the vast majority. And it was sort of similar levels for the question, I have responsibility to improve my community. There it was 75%. And again, you can see that there were some more that fell there in the middle, but almost sort of very few, less than 1/10 of the sample, who said that they disagree with that statement. A similar sort of finding comes around the future mindedness. And so in this bar graph, you can see their response, or sorry, in this pie chart, I should say, their responses to I am hopeful about my future. And that blue, that sort of turquoise blue, and the purple, there is sort of the two highest. It's saying that those who responded very much like me or a lot like me. And so basically, again, this is almost 3/4 of the sample that said they really identify with this statement, with I am hopeful about my future. Another 80% also in response to a question about whether they think about who they're going to be often in the future, 80% agreed with that. So I think the takeaway from that is sort of that that this beginning, at least, of the pandemic and the quarantine, even though it disrupted their lives deeply, it didn't necessarily undermine their sense of responsibility to their communities, that sort of element of the formation that I think is important in Jesuit schools. But also it didn't entirely undermine this thinking and this hopefulness about the future, that there might be a time both for them personally that things will be different, or that they can still have goals and hopes for that, for something beyond the pandemic. Now, moving into the open-ended questions. So here are some of the themes from sort of looking through all the answers and responses. And so a first one is that not all are impacted, and some of them see opportunities for growth. And I think that's important. And this is not to belittle or to sort of diminish the fact that there are large mental health needs, that many young people are struggling. But I think it's also keep an important mind that some of them are feeling like, well, this is, not really affecting me all that much. And so in my study, there were about 10% who said that their lives really didn't change or weren't affected. So their response to that question was no. And then in asking them too about what changes they foresaw in the short term in their lives, another sort of 9 or 10%, so another 1 in 10 said, I don't really foresee any changes. Things are going to sort of return back to normal. Then there was even a group that talked about positive impacts when we were talking about the future. And some of them talked about things that kind of range. Some of them were personal. So some said, I'll have a greater appreciation for certain things in life. Some of that, those who had positive or described positive impacts talked about their opportunities for growth in the sense of learning new activities or new skills. And some of them talked more about sort of societal things. There were a number of responses that gave me a little bit of a chuckle that was talking about hygiene. That was saying, we as a society and me, I'm going to be cleaner. And I'm going to learn from this. And that was sort of their takeaway for the changes into the future. Now, a second theme here was that school changes matter, but they do for a host of reasons. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. So over a quarter of the sample mentioned school changes when they were talking about what had been impacted and affected in their lives. And some of those talked about motivation, they talked about focus, they talked about grades. But there were a number of other things that these young people talked about. It was kind of on their minds and weighing on them. One of it was their future and sort of the future trajectory. And so talking about their either college search process or their college going experience, right? And saying that my school is being impacted now. I don't know what that's going to mean for me for looking ahead beyond high school. I don't know what colleges are going to assess me on. I can't go to visit colleges and get a sense of that, right? Or my college experience might be virtual, and that's going to be really strange and different. So that was another way that the school changes were sort of affecting them. And then another way was really the social and psychological supports. So, I mean, school is a deep daily part of young people's routine, right? And it's important in their identity, it's important in their socializing, and it's also important in their sense of sort of giving structure to their lives. And when all of that is kind of removed and changed deeply, that is impacting them. And so a lot of young people were talking about the struggles of not just not getting to see their friends, but not having random interactions in the hallways, not getting to have the chat with a teacher they might, right? Not just having that daily experience of going to school, having that rhythm and structure to their day. Others also talked about that really weighing heavily on their mental health. And so for school, I think, particularly in the spring, and it still continues, there's a lot of focus and talk that you hear in the media and popular discourse around the actual instruction part and what students might be learning out or losing out in terms of their learning. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that that's affecting them in these other ways deeply. And so I want to give you just one quote here to sort of exemplify this. And so one student told me, or wrote in the survey, staying motivated in school is my biggest challenge. Everything has been turned topsy-turvy, just as I was assimilating to freshman year at a new high school. In addition, I work in my bedroom, which was previously associated in my mind with relaxation. So switching into work mode was difficult. So here this young person talks about the school disruption turned everything topsy-turvy, but also the second point I think is interesting, that it affected their home life because it turned a space that allowed them sort of a space to sort of refresh and regenerate and maybe important for their mental health, and it turned that into a workspace. So it added a level of stress to that. So a third theme here I want to highlight is that online communication is not sufficient for their social needs. So over and over again, these young people were telling me, yeah, I can stay connected socially and I'm doing school, or sorry, virtually, and I'm doing school virtually, but that just isn't cutting it for me. And I think this is important because there tends to be, again, discourses and ideas that young people are very much connected, right? That they're always on their phones, that they're checking Twitter, that they're this generation that is so in tune to technology, and that's what they want. But what I'm really hearing from these young people during this time in the spring was that that was not it, that they were craving the physical part and the physical connection with other people, not just in terms of their friends, but also in terms of their school settings and also in terms of the broader society. They were feeling isolated from their family, from other people. And that was impacting them and their mental health as well. And the last theme here that I want to touch on is this idea of a sense of missing out. So a lot of young people in this survey very strongly discussed that they felt like there were typical experiences, there were things they were expecting, things they'd been looking forward to, things they maybe felt they deserved, that they were missing out on because of all this. And that was a really building sense of frustration and disappointment. And so to give you one sense of that, here's one quote from one young person who said, it has affected my senior year of high school, the year I looked forward to spending with my peers the most and making my final memories. I won't even have a proper graduation. My first semester of college will most likely be online. This has brought me fear and anxiety. So I think what this student is trying to convey is that there was something special about senior year. And this is sort of built up in our society if we think about it too. It's in movies, it's in the way we talk about high school, right? There's certain expectations and hopes people have. Then there's also a part of wanting to celebrate and accomplishments and that graduation part, right? And this person directly ties that into their mental health. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, that this missing out isn't just like, oh man, I wish I had that, but it's actually deeply affecting the ways that they're feeling and their psychological states and their emotions. So before I sort of move into talking about some broader kind of takeaways, I do want to have a caveat where, again, I want to emphasize that it's difficult from the way the data was and how many representatives I had from other subgroups, both in terms of gender and race, ethnicity in particular, to make assertions about those, to say like these things were different for these groups. But there are a couple points I want to highlight. One is that I was getting a sense in looking through the data and analyzing it, that there were some differences for different groups. And so just to give an example, when I was coding some of their responses and looking at the numbers, the Latino or Latina participants, they did tend to talk a little bit more about academics, and they did tend to talk a little bit more about their family and particularly financial challenges tied into their family. And so I don't want to make sort of broad assertions, but I do think, again, it's important to highlight that there are going to be different challenges and impacts for young people just because of the ways that their identities and where they are in society, where they live, the community they belong to, they're actually family, right? Or they're going to experience this in different ways. And so you're going to get some who have talked about losing family members, multiple family members, their family members losing jobs. And then you're going to get others that, yeah, a sense of boredom is kind of their broad takeaway because their family, or their community is not as directly impacted. Another point here is that these Latina, and also Black participants in this study, they still had high levels of hope about the future and still had high levels of social responsibility. So when I tried to look at those, there weren't sort of broad differences or significant differences in those. And I think that's also important to keep in mind, that even as they may be being differentially impacted, those communities, at least in this study, and with those samples, there wasn't a drastic difference in those measures. But there was a pretty significant difference in terms of their levels of trust. And then this played out in some of the open-ended questions as well. And so, for instance, on the trust, there were lower levels of trust in the national government and in police, which is not surprising, but is, I think, interesting in thinking about this as sort of a precursor to some of what we've seen in terms of Black Lives Matter and some of the sort of growing awareness and discussion and protests around racial injustice. And so I think that is just sort of an interesting thing in the background of some of this that I think is going to probably even been heightened and going to play out even further as the pandemic has progressed, and these issues also have continued to be out there in society and be front and center. So in the last 5 minutes, I want to touch mainly on these sort of insights that I feel like I can maybe offer, these kind of broad insights. And so first one is, I think it's important to normalize and recognize struggles. So a lot of these young people, as I said, not all of them, but a lot of them were talking about different things that they were dealing with. And it's hard to say, okay, they're all dealing with this, and so we have to do, this intervention to help support them. But a really basic thing, I think, is just recognizing that we are living through a pandemic, and this is hard. I have to remind myself of this some days where I'm feeling really stressed and overwhelmed, and I say, wait a minute, like, this is a pandemic. This is strange and uncomfortable and in some ways unprecedented, and it is going to be hard. And I think it's really important to normalize and recognize that with young people. A second point is creating spaces particularly for social interaction, connection, and belonging. So schools are approaching the fall in different ways. Some are doing hybrid, some are doing some form of in-person or socially distanced. No matter what it be, I think trying to think about these spaces that exist and operate through schools, like extracurriculars, homerooms, big sort of events and celebrations, building into them a component that is about interaction, connection, and belonging. So if it's going to be something like a graduation, right, it's important to recognize and celebrate, but if it's just them sort of looking at a screen and recording a video of themselves, like saying something about graduating, I mean, that's not going to give them that sense of connection and interaction. And so I think it's important to leverage these spaces and these things to build that and to make that very intentionally a part of them. Another key component is imagining milestones. There's actually a lot of literature in developmental psychology and in adolescence that milestones are really important to recognize those, to give time to celebrate those, and for young people to experience those. And so this generation of young people, right, has grown up imagining my graduation is going to be like this, my prom is going to be like this, even getting my driver's license, that came up often. And so I think helping them reimagine those and recreate those and giving them a voice in how those will look is important. So maybe you can't do a prom in the same way, in the way that they've been hoping for years to do, but maybe you can work with them to try and figure out how can we still turn something out of that, make that into some sort of milestone. And again, with their voice and with their agency, so that it's something that connects with them and helps them fill that need or those desires that they have. That includes things too, like freshman orientation, as I mentioned here, graduations, getting their driver's license. There are all sort of a number of these markers in adolescence that we think of. Another one is providing mental health supports through reframing. And so what I mean by this is sort of a sense of, first of all, recognizing the challenges, as I talked about, but also thinking about highlighting the opportunities, or helping provide some perspective. So, there are going to be some young people who have just been drastically impacted by COVID-19, and their world has been entirely changed. They've lost family members. Their family members have lost jobs. They have housing insecurity, food insecurity. But there are others who are going to be struggling through some things that can be reframed. That can be, okay, so you're finding difficulty, keeping yourself entertained. Well, maybe we can think of it as an opportunity to explore new activities, right? Or you're realizing that you're really missing these parts of your social connections. Well, maybe that can help to be reframed into an appreciation of those, or an appreciation of what it means to have these people in your life. And some other things that here, just some ideas that sort of build off of this, helping them support them in developing and thinking through new family or new personal traditions, or even developing new school activities and traditions. And then on the personal level, like I mentioned, kind of new hobbies or new activities that they take a part in. And then also kind of as part of this, maybe the adapting of routines. So reframing the fact that they're not coming into school every day, not just as sort of an upending of their world, but as let's try and create a new routine. Let's reframe this as an opportunity for you to think about what you can do and how you can restructure parts of your life to still provide you with maybe that structure or that routine that you were getting at school. But giving them that kind of support of, again, this reframing of certain things that they're experiencing and going through. And the last point here is just kind of similar in building off of that one, thinking through new trajectories. I heard from a lot of these young people that they were struggling with thinking ahead to their future. They were like, I don't know what next school year is going to be like. I don't know what college is going to be like. I don't know what the world is going to be like to some degree. Some of them are saying that, some of them are saying, I don't know, how this is going to impact me and my family. And so I think kind of providing them a space and supporting them and helping them work through and think through what will and what can the future look like. So rather than it being just about, my idea of what graduation was going to be like, my idea of the college search process, my college experience was going to all be this way, and it's all been entirely destroyed, you're helping them kind of rethink it into, okay, what can it be? What can I do? Right? What opportunities are there going to be into my future? What is still there and still possible? And so helping them kind of reflect and think through that, because to some degree, they're experiencing a loss of agency and control. A lot of what's going on right now is beyond their immediate control. But they do have this still ability to think through into the future, even though there's going to be a lot that's unknown and may shift, to sort of take that plan and say, what is my life trajectory going to look like? How can I adapt my thinking about myself and what I want to do into the future to what's shifting and what's going on? Even if I can't control the way the virus is spreading, if I can't control what my schooling is going to look like, if it's going to go hybrid or in person, if I can't control the impacts it might be on my family. And so that's kind of again, a last kind of broader thought. So one more point before I open up the questions, I just want to say, where is this all going? So this was in the spring, and things have drastically changed. Even though we're still living through the pandemic, there's a lot that's shifting and changing every day. And so with that in mind, I am currently just right now beginning a second round of survey. And so that's going on right now. It's basically a follow-up survey. And so some of the young people I'm trying to continue on with, some of them offered their emails for follow-up, but then I'm also just going to try and get as many schools and young people's voices as I can in the second round of surveys right now. And I've included a particular question about how they're feeling about how their school is handling instruction, so whether they're in person or hybrid or all of that. And then I'm going to follow that up in January with some more targeted interviews or I'm gonna do some calls with some of the young people and talk to them in person and ask them more about this and be able to probe a little bit deeper, and then also get a sense of how they're thinking about it in January, which, you know, who knows right now where we'll be in terms of the pandemic, but it'll give them an opportunity to also be reflecting back on what they were thinking about in the spring, what they were thinking about in the fall as well. So with that in mind, I want to open this up to questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second so I can see any that have come up in the chat and respond to all of you. And I thank you for your time and interest. And I'm excited to hear what some of you are curious about or what questions you might have.
Gabriel, I'll get the questions started just so folks can have a minute or two to pop some questions there in the chat window. First of all, thank you so much. It really strikes me how timely and relevant your work is, and how particularly affirming it is to us in Jesuit schools, considering so much of your population were Jesuit school students, so thank you. Mm-hmm. My question for you would be, as a developmental psychologist, what was the result that you were the most surprised by? Having a sense of what you might get going into it, knowing adolescents so well, what surprised you the most?
Yeah. I think two things, and they were kind of things I touched on, but I think it's important to come back to them. And one is the part about the online connections. You know, I kind of expected that they would be talking about struggles with schooling. You know, as an instructor myself, although at the college level, I know that there are a lot of us instructors who struggled with the move to online schooling. And so I knew that that was going to be something that on a student end, right, that they're going to be also describing. But when they were talking also about it socially, I thought that was really interesting, you know, because we do think and talk about young people as like, oh, you know, they're quick to send off a message to their friend or post a video on TikTok, or, you know, be sort of going through their Twitter feed at night, you know, liking all their friends, whatever, or Instagram. But what was coming through loud and clear with this was that all of that is kind of supplementary to what's like the essence of their social needs as a young person. And that's personal contact. You know, and that makes sense to some degree developmentally, because they're still trying to figure out who they are, they're building those bonds, right? And sort of social interactions are so much a part of what it means to be an adolescent. But I think it was kind of surprising to me to hear that they were saying, yeah, these virtual means of doing it are just not cutting it. And the second one was kind of this silver lining a little bit, although I don't know if I'd call it silver lining, but kind of this element of that there was a not insignificant part of these, or a group of these young people who were saying either, I don't really feel like this is impacting me, or I'm going to talk about these positive things I'm getting out of it. And in both of those groups, they often were not belittling sort of COVID. They were saying, you know, like, I know there are a lot of people out there who are suffering, or I really feel for these people when I hear about it in the news. But then they could also say at the same time, like, this is giving me an opportunity to spend more time with my family. Or, you know, I'm trying to focus on new activities I can do, or I'm getting a greater appreciation for the things I don't have now. And part of that was a surprise for me. And part of that, I think, you know, in reflection now, resonates with sort of a Jesuit spirit of reflection, and maybe trying to not just sort of, or to try to understand maybe the privileges and benefits we do have, rather than sort of just be entirely lost in what we don't have in a given moment.
And I also think about how, you know, so many of our schools have spent a significant amount of time and resources trying to build opportunities to promote those connections and the reflective component, you know, so that students weren't just English and math and science in their classes, which are of course very important, but that schools did try in the midst of everything else as they were figuring this out as it was going on in the spring, but tried to have time for that reflective component in the service work or the ministry work that they were doing. So that resonates.
Yeah. And I think that is, you know, I think that's one of the most important things. And you know, it's exciting to me to hear that schools are doing it, because I think the discourses, again, what's being talked about out there is these students are learning or losing out on their learning. Or when you hear about the discussions about face-to-face or virtual or hybrid, right, it's often a focus around sort of content and learning and instruction. And I don't think there's the sort of out there in the popular media a focus on that kind of reflective component, that it's also important to be providing them spaces to process what's going on, and to be sort of keeping that sense of reflection and thoughtfulness about what's going on, rather than kind of what we're all living through, which is like every day can feel different and we don't know where things are going to turn, and it just feels like so much uncertainty and flux, and we're constantly trying to react.
I might jump in with a question, and also just to say the chat screen is wide open. So if you have any questions, please type them in so that that they can be answered in the time remaining. But I do have a question, and you touched on different aspects of it, but just out of curiosity, in terms of those students who feel that there has been some element of silver lining, if you will, in terms of the pandemic and being moved out of their school buildings, to what degree possibly has that actually assisted in terms of inclusiveness in classrooms? Oftentimes students that are the most vocal or the confident in a classroom situation, you know, they're fine, and other students may feel withdrawn for whatever reason and be quiet. But you know, on a screen, or when you have to just type your answers, those kinds of things, if that might not possibly be sort of a bit of a silver lining, some students blossoming in some way because it's a bit more of a, I don't want to say democratic, but if you know where I'm going, a
Mm-hmm.
situation, you know, not, what are your thoughts about that? I'd be curious to hear.
Yeah, so this is interesting. I was just having this conversation with someone the other day, sort of on an anecdotal level, about how some young people, and you know, because of various reasons, it could be identifying as an introvert, it could be, just not feeling like you belong, let's say, to the socioeconomic class of your fellow students, or you just moved into your school. There are many reasons, but some young people, the social intensity of high school, and the academic intensity at times can be really difficult to manage. And so, having that space from it, or being able to do it in your own way, in your own home, for some of them, I think is, sort of positive. And there were even a couple of the participants who talked about it, said like, yeah, I'm naturally an introvert, and I've really been enjoying this space, or this sort of time. And I think there were others who explicitly said like, I identify as an extrovert. And some of this self-awareness I thought was really interesting. And that's why this is really hard for me, because I can't be out there and be talking to people. But to speak to your point, I think there is a way that for some people, for some young people, this is going to give them an opportunity to focus and maybe to be in a space that they feel safer in. So yeah, it adds to
Thank,
that silver lining.
Yeah, thank you. I actually, it seemed like that was sort of filtering through some of the things you were mentioning in terms of that
Mhm.
optimism. Have a couple of questions that people are asking. I'll just read this one from Judy Alessandri. For the students that are doing well, what are they doing? What are the parents doing that are contributing to their
Mm.
success at home? How are they replicating some of the effective experiences that are keeping them feel connected? And did you hear any anecdotal stories that showed some keys that can be shared with students and parents? This is a great
Yeah.
question. How can you replicate the success that some are feeling, and how is it manifesting itself?
Yeah, that is a great question. And the first thing I guess I will say to this is the way I'm going to answer this, I think, is sort of assuming that the young people we're talking about are not ones who have lost family members, who themselves are immunocompromised, or have had a really deep impact, let's say like multiple parents losing jobs, or again, as I mentioned earlier, sort of the food or housing insecurity. I think when they've experienced that, there's like a whole different level, right? And we can think of this psychologically, where those are sort of basic psychological needs, of both sort of your intimacy with your family, or your support there, but also housing, food. And so I think that entirely reframes your experience, and what young people might need to cope. But for the broader sort of group that it may be entering their lives, they may know some people have gotten sick, maybe even family members, but it hasn't been that deep impact. Um, I would say there are a couple things. And one is, again, being successfully able to sort of say, these things that I had in my mind, in some way I'm going to let go of, or I'm going to be flexible about. And so, that might mean graduation, that might mean my extracurricular, that might mean my college search process, right? Being able to sort of recognize that this was something I was hoping for and looking forward to, and it's now going to be either radically different or it's gone. And that's really hard. I mean, I don't sort of say that lightly, but I think that's why that reframing I was talking about is important. When they're saying like, okay, like I can no longer do this the same way. I don't know what my college search process is going to be like, but I also know that at some point we're going to have a vaccine, things are going to return to normal. I'm going to be able to go and live in a college dorm, right, at some point in the future. And that was something I looked forward to. Or that sort of being able to see a broader context and picture. Um, I also think another successful strategy was having having connection with their family, but that not being overwhelming. And so, this can depend on family dynamics, but some of them who talked about really like, even if some of them said, I didn't always get along with my sister before, but like this has provided a really great opportunity for us to share in a deeper way. And some of them said that with their family as well. And so I think when a family connection can be built through this, and sort of greater bonds, and appreciating that time of, this is a really unique experience to get to spend more time with my family, or to get to live through something really difficult together and grow closer. That was really helpful. That being said, there are also some stories where, the parents are sort of over their shoulder in their virtual classes, right? And they're saying like, I can't stand the fact that my, parents are just too much on me and I don't have that space at school to go and get away from them. So I think kind of working through, families can think about how can we work through a healthy balance where we take advantage to some degree of what is an opportunity for families, I think, to spend a different type of time together, but not make it too sort of infringing on some of what they're doing. And then the last part I would say with just some last success stories is, throwing out different hobbies and activities, right? I mean, it is a strange time, but it is an opportunity, I think, to learn something new. And not everyone's going to have that benefit, but it could be something even like a school creating new virtual clubs, or, giving young people that ability to do that, like share something new that you're learning and doing with your classmates, or, something like that. But those new activities, those new hobbies. And so they can say, yeah, during this time, I've learned this, even if I struggled and had to deal with this, and this. So
Excellent points. There's a question from Erin DeClotz. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Erin. But her question is this: do you have any predictions about the long-term effects of adolescence on growing up during this time? Predictions she would be curious about, psychological or developmental.
Yeah. So this is a great question, and I say it's hard for me to say that I would say like with certainty this is going to happen to this generation. I take some solace in research that has been done, longitudinal research on people who were youth and were adolescents during World War II and during the Great Depression. And some of what's come out of that research is that actually those generations developed sort of a different outlook on life and a different resilience. And sort of in some ways, some of it can be framed as almost they were stronger, psychologically stronger, because at such a key developmental time, they had to experience something that was really difficult and challenging, right? And I think that there is a way that I could certainly, this is for sure is going to mark this generation, but part of it could be an experience of like, having had to adapt at such a young age, having to have sort of changed and gone through some of this together. I mean, we live in a very divisive society, but as time sort of progresses on, I think COVID-19 and this pandemic will become something that's a shared experience that we'll have had that in some way will sort of connect us. And so I do think there is that opportunity for actually sort of a resiliency and learning sort of different and new coping strategies. I think another one that I would mention there is kind of along the lines of that, a sense of appreciation. And not to say that other young people are not going to be appreciative or generations are not appreciative, but I do think experiencing something like this, there's a lot of research that they're going to have a different framework when things do return to some sense of normal on what they have, right? And I think we can all kind of speak to that. That's sort of a natural part of our psychology, is we tend to sort of become complacent in the things that are really important to us. And then when we lose them or they're threatened, it sort of forces us to reflect on the importance that they have in our lives.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions. If anyone has another question they'd like to type in quickly. And what I will do in the interim is I'll turn it back to Kristen and Gabriel and let you offer any final thoughts that you might have in the next few minutes. And so please go ahead.
Yeah, I have actually one other thought. Oh, sorry, Kristen, I don't know if I... Okay. It's less directly about this research, but it's more about sort of higher education and my place there as a professor and some of what I've been thinking about in terms of that, because part of it is thinking about these young people, what they're experiencing now, right? And part of it is what is going to shift and change about the society they're going into, right? And so some of the young people, for instance, talked about college, and others talked about the economy, being concerned with their jobs and their careers. And I will say that I think that this pandemic is going to have a large impact on higher education. There was already sort of some talk about changes. There's already been a lot of discussion, right, about rising costs. And sort of, I think to some degree, higher education was facing a reckoning. And I think this pandemic has brought it on. And the reason I sort of just bring this into the conversation is, as we're thinking about helping prepare young people and rethink their futures and imagine what that's going to be like, it's also important to keep in mind that I don't think college and universities are going to be in 5 years, well, let's say 4 or 5 years from now, what they were like 4 or 5 years ago. And so I think that's important to keep in mind too.
Thank you to Gabby, who just said in the chat.
Thank you,
Not a question, but thank you for this research. I found myself nodding along the entire time, and I can't wait for the second round of findings. We appreciate that, Gabby. I was nodding as well. And that's actually a good ending point. And I would say that the JSN looks forward to supporting as we can Gabriel's next round of research. I mean, thinking about how interesting this is to hear about adolescents' insights from the very beginning of the pandemic. And here we are now months later into it, and to see what's changed. I think as the adults that can kind of resonate with each of us. So we will plan when the time is right to notify, as we did before, the counselors and the JSN and principals about the opportunity to participate as a school in the second round of research. So please be on the lookout for that. And then I know Gabriel will be following up with all of the people that have registered for this presentation. So we thank you for that. Thank you so much, Gabriel. We really appreciate your time and all of
Thank you, Gabriel.
Yeah, thank you both. And thank you to all who attended, and also Gabby, and this is a particular to you as well, but to all the schools who participated and were a part of it as well.
All right. Thanks so much, Carol.
Thank you everyone for attending, and we appreciate, as always, the ability to be a part of things that are going on in the Jesuit School Network, and value so much the collegiality that exists between our two organizations. So thank you. Everyone have a great afternoon. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you in the next round. Bye.
Bye, everyone.